Okay, so the stream is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
I'm Mike McCain.
and tonight we complete the list. Watching 100 Movies is all about watching the AFI's top 100 American films list. And tonight we have done that. Technically watched more than 100, but tonight we complete the list with number 2, The Godfather, and number 1, Citizen Kane. What a long, strange trip it has been.
Yes, I was going to say I was about to go into a bunch of different things but I realized we already talked about a lot of it on another episode about
Yeah.
how many states I've lived in and places I've lived since we started,
Mm-hmm.
and just how long it has been, but yet how I guess it was quickly, but we basically finished like the top 30 in the last 6 months.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it helps a lot when we kind of just can have a regular schedule. Not that there's any, good reason. Hang on. Just making sure everything is good here because um, we have a viewer who says they're not getting sound. That doesn't seem right. It should be. It should be getting sound. Um, um, okay, so like obviously you hear me, right?
Yep.
So you're responding to me. Um, why wouldn't it be? So there's sound there. Yeah, I'm doing the exact same thing I always do. Uh, why? Um, okay. I want to hang on. Okay. Okay. You know what? Okay. No, this is not our end because I'm getting.
I'm checking it on.
Uh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
working.
yeah. So there is sound on the stream. I would so for our viewer here, double check on your end. But thanks for saying so. Just in case it was a problem on our end, I hope you can get it sorted out. Um, Gosh, well, that was a brief diversion. Technical difficulties is always exciting. Um, so where were we? We were talking about how we did talk a lot about our sort of reflections on the overall project when we did that like resorting the list episode, right? Before
Yep.
we begin the top 10. And we're gonna talk a little bit more, I think, about what are our plans moving forward. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and talk about The Godfather and Citizen Kane. Specifically, The Godfather first, because that's number 2.
Yes. Well, I think we've probably mentioned, for anybody who's been watching regularly, I think you kind of already have an idea of our general takes on this, but I think
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting now that we both rewatched it.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I've always really enjoyed this movie. Um, I mean, it's not a happy movie, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you're certainly not the only one, right? I mean, it's number 2 on the list because a lot of people really like it.
yes, I really like a lot of the things this movie does. I always get fully engrossed in the story. I think the technical capabilities are phenomenal, of what they did with this movie, and I always find myself, like I said, immersed in it. It's one of those for me. I don't watch it like a Shawshank Redemption or something like that. Where, but you know how when you start watching Shawshank, like you end up 2 hours later, like wherever you started it, you end up watching as long as you possibly can,
Hmm.
and you just get locked into the story. I mean, when I sit down to watch this movie, like I, I don't pause it. I don't get up and do other things. Like it's just it always grabs me and gets its hooks into me. And I think it's very powerful. I think the story of both of these movies obviously share a similar theme in that they are a personal study of someone who is starts off with ideals and gets corrupted by the world in which they live. Obviously,
Hmm.
that's not they tell in two very different ways, but I've always I don't know if the word related because I don't feel like I've been corrupted by any means, but I've always more empathetic
Hmm.
to Michael, um, and more sad that he does get corrupted by that world. Um, it always it just moves me in a way that doesn't always happen in movies. So
Hmm.
kind of my sort of overall arching. Obviously, there's lots of
Sure.
details to talk about, but that's kind of my
Yeah. So I think that's a good sort of starting thought to for it, just because, as you mentioned, The Godfather is one of those movies that has come up over and over again as we've gone through the list. In particular, partly because Godfather Part Two is literally also on the list, so we talked about that already, and the first movie certainly comes up in connection to that. I think it's perhaps notable that The Godfather comes up in these discussions a lot more than Citizen Kane does, partly because I think Citizen Kane might be. I mean, it's for for better or worse, it's kind of seen as this sort of elevated on a pedestal sort of movie, right? So the idea of comparing anything to it doesn't happen as frequently because it's like almost seen as untouchable. But the Godfather is much more sort of in the mix in that regard, right? Like it's considered this masterpiece, um, and as we've discussed on the show before, it's not my favorite. I can certainly respect and admire so many things about the way that it's made. I think it's an incredibly well made movie. It's well told. The cinematography is incredible. It's just doing a lot of really cool things, telling a very complicated story in a comprehensible way. It's become iconic. I'm always vaguely surprised when I rewatch it at how little screen time Marlon Brando actually has, given how iconic he is in the role. But I think it just, like you said, in terms of relating to the character, I don't as much. I mean, maybe part of that is knowing what I know about what happens later in the story, like in part two, and just seeing how dark he goes. Maybe I'm just not able to let that go, and every time I look at him in part one, that's what I'm seeing. So it's harder to see him as someone who actually was good and is corrupted by the world he lives in, as you mentioned, and maybe I tend to see him more as someone who really wasn't ever that good, and it's just that he sort of pretended for a while until he stopped pretending because he didn't have to.
yeah. Yeah, I could see how that you could take it with that interpretation because of how long it's been around and like you said, how much more depth we have from having seen, future versions of him. But
Yeah, because the thing is that other than a sort of half-hearted reluctance to get involved, and the very clear reluctance that Don Corleone has in terms of I didn't want this for Michael. Michael doesn't really require a whole lot of persuading to get not only involved but extremely involved. You know what I mean? So like I wonder watching it like there's a little bit of this narrative that seems like it's supposed to be he was the one that didn't really belong there, but he got pulled in. But I'm not. sure that's really on screen. You know what I mean? Like we're kind of told that, but we don't really see him do anything except exist on the periphery until he moves into the center.
I I feel like there's a little bit more to it than that. Um, I think he gets thrust into his first kind of action, which is to go kill the policeman, because he's the only one that can get away with it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then, you know, I feel like his whole development in Italy is kind of what solidifies why he, sort of that's where his sort of disconnect happens, because he falls in love, he gets married, and then because of what he did, they intend to kill him, but they end up killing his wife,
Well,
and that's what kind of puts him over the edge. So I feel like that piece is more transitional than maybe it is explicitly is stated.
I could see that. I could see that. I have some questions about that section, and these are like sincere questions about the story. But yeah, like I could see that because on the one hand, we could argue that, like, I mean, he only goes to Italy because he's having to flee because he murdered two people, right?
Right.
But at the same time, it's specifically this idea is the people who are trying to kill our dad. We need to stop them. Like and that's why. And so it's not seen as an aggressive; it's seen as a defensive sort of action, right? But at the same time, you know, it's a little bit like they tried to kill our guy, so we successfully killed their guys, but then when they take revenge on that, they've gone too far. You know what I mean? It's like a little bit like now, and again, I can totally engage with the intended emotional level on it. It's only when I kind of take a step back and I find it harder to let some of that go. But like without wanting to be dismissive of any of that, the the uh, the section where he's in Italy, how long is that supposed to be? How much time is supposed to pass there?
I think it's stated before he leaves, like how long he has to go for.
Uh
I
huh.
think, I mean, it's a minimum of a year.
Because
So
like he's literally still got the black eye healing when he's talking about like asking this girl to marry him.
yeah, I mean that part obviously that happened quickly. Yes, that's intended to be that way. Yes,
Okay.
that
Well, I feel like while by and large I think most of the story is, as I mentioned, a complex story told very comprehensively. That's one part that has always been confusing to me, is that it is not at all clear how long that period of time is, because it implies some time has passed like outside of that scenario, but there's no evidence of it. Like for all we know, that entire storyline happens over the course of a couple of days. Like I'm not what happens in the movie to tell us that it's longer than that. And I mean this seriously. I'm not trying to criticize it. I'm maybe missing the signs.
so the two main parts that I think it is intentionally meant to be ambiguous,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, because it's supposed to be somewhat surreal for him just in general that he had to do that.
Yeah.
And time passes a little different because he's in. I mean, I think it's the intention is to have time feel a little odd.
Mm-hmm.
So the two clues are, the beginning when they say how you're going to have to go for at least X time, and I think it's a minimum of a year. I believe is
Mm-hmm.
what Sonny says.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, sorry. So he has the intention of at least being there that long.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know that it takes up the whole year, but I don't think that that's important. And then like the other piece is actually his black eye healing,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a rather severe black eye. Like it's not a black eye that I think
It's
in a
true.
couple of
Yeah.
days. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think the intention was to show how badly he was hurt and that this moved quickly, but yet leave us in this sort of surreal, we're not sure how much time has passed. Like I think the intention of the movie is for you to feel a little disoriented on the
Yeah.
time.
Now, and I do so I agree that I think that's intentional, and I think that it largely is effective on the emotional level, even as like that I struggled a little bit on the logical level, but at the same time, um, the just the emotional logic of it, which is I think what was intended, is just this idea that he stepped kind of through the looking glass, right? Like
Mhm.
he finally agreed to get involved in a meaningful way with all of this. He was in the war, so presumably it wasn't the first time he killed somebody. Although I don't recall it. Did he ever talk about that?
Sonny talked about it, uh, sort of peripherally, like, hey, this
Mm-hmm.
isn't like being in the war where you're,
Right.
shooting from range at a rifle. Like, you're going to have to get up there and get dirty.
Right. So in any case, though, he certainly has done this transformative act. He crosses a threshold of no return, right?
Right. Yeah.
And after that, everything's different, and it's driven home by he literally has to leave everything he knows and go and live with people who he's really only kind of told that they are relations, right? I mean, I don't think he knows any of those people, does he?
No, and so just even hearing you describe it, I think this helps elucidate kind of our differing positions on this movie, because I totally get what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
but this is also why this whole sequence is my favorite sequence.
Mm-hmm.
Like, from the way that he is super nervous about going into this, like the way that, he then doesn't do anything that they told him to do, like, don't look anybody in the eye, don't stay too long, drop the gun by your side so they think you still have it. Like, he doesn't do any of that. He screws the whole thing up
Yeah.
from the what you're supposed to do part of it. But then to the point is like the unintended consequences that he didn't realize, that he didn't think through.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, to your other sort of critique of it, is that, like, you know him as multiple stories worth of person.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same thing that keeps happening to him, is that he thinks he's doing these things from a noble place because he was at one time a good, quote unquote, good guy. But the whole "they keep pulling me back in" is not a reality that, from the second movie. Like, he
Mm-hmm.
keeps putting himself in positions where this is the natural repercussions of what happened. And
Yeah.
yes, it's sad that his wife dies because of this thing, but I don't see it as them going too far. I see it as this is what he didn't really think through when he decided to your point, step through the looking glass.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes it so sad and so tragic, is that he these things don't keep happening to him. He is taking these actions, and these are the repercussions of his own actions.
Yeah.
And I just, that, to me, that is really powerful and interesting. Whereas it feels like, your criticisms
Well,
are, that's not as,
well. So let me put this in perspective a little bit, right? Um, we're not talking about, or at least from what I'm saying, and I hope this is clear to anyone who's going to hear me say anything critical about The Godfather. We're not talking about is this a good movie or a bad movie. It's only does it belong at number 2 of all time. In my
right.
opinion, I think it goes significantly lower, but it's still unequivocally a good movie.
Yes, and all these things that I'm sort of arguing or counterpointing to you
Mm-hmm.
I understand where you're coming from. Trust
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Well,
And
yeah, so one of the things that occurred to me, a connection that I frankly hadn't considered before, but occurred to me just now as you were talking, is comparing Michael to Walter White from Breaking Bad. Did you watch all of Breaking Bad?
yes,
So, I think as a comparison, anyone who hasn't watched Breaking Bad, I mean, the basic plot is that we have this guy who seems like just ordinary chemistry teacher, but he may be talented and underused as a teacher, but diagnosed with cancer, decides that the way to earn money to pay for his cancer treatment is to make and sell meth. But as he gets more and more involved with that, he discovers that it's really less about, oh, I just need the money in order to pay for cancer treatment, and more that he actually likes the power that he feels being good at that and getting so deeply involved with it. And over the course of the story, even though he remains throughout the protagonist, so to speak, in the literary sense that we're following that character primarily, but he ultimately becomes the villain of the story pretty unambiguously. And
Yes.
I think there's some interesting nuance in that, in the sense of realizing that the character is basically doing a lot of really awful things, and then by the end, he gets what's coming to him based on his own decisions ultimately. But
Right.
so if we talk about Michael, it again becomes the same question. Like in Breaking Bad, obviously it's a whole several seasons of TV show. They have a lot more time to go into some of the nuances of this sort of thing. But I feel like the show takes a pretty clear stance by the end that this wasn't something that happened to Walter White that made him this bad guy. He really always was this guy, and it's just that before he kind of had these limitations that he put on himself because he felt like he had to live in normal society. And then once he realized he no longer had to keep those brakes on, he took them off and finally let everything he had always really wanted go, right? Like, and it was not that, oh, he used to be a good guy and then he became a bad guy. It was more, he had felt all along like he has to be a good guy. He's pretending to be a good guy. He's trying to be a good guy, but that's never what he really wanted. And once he is able to do anything he wants, what he wants is not to be a good guy. And so it makes me wonder about Michael. And again, it's like what we're talking about, like in principle, so many of his decisions, certainly in this movie, um, are done with the nominal motivation of protecting the family, right? But that's what we see happen in two, is that increasingly, even though it's still nominally about protecting the family, we start seeing how often his decisions are actually hurting the family, hurting the people that ostensibly he's doing all of this for, in the interest of actually protecting his own personal power level, right? So, when people start doing things that you know don't fall in line with what he thinks should happen, they get punished, even if theoretically they are the very people that all of this is for. And so that makes me wonder how much Michael is like Walter White in that regard. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely see the comparison and it makes sense. Um, I've always looked at it a little differently now that you kind of walk through that, in that what I don't, I think at the beginning, Michael's not necessarily good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like he was the good guy, and it's maybe a little different than maybe what kind of, when I kind of gave the quick synopsis. It's that all of these guys are complicated, that even though they're in this bad world, like there's complexities to it, just like how, his father doesn't really want him to get involved. Like his father is very similar to him in some ways, in that he, and that's what we see in part two, is that, he gets into this with sort of he's kind of disconnected. Like he's not actively like trying to be bad. He's just
Mm-hmm.
trying to get by in an immigrant situation. And this happens to be what he chooses and what makes him successful. And
Mm-hmm.
so, Michael's not enjoying being the bad guy. He's not, it's not like he was all, like, to your point, he's not like he was always bad. He just had been trying to be good. It's that he was both, depending on where his situation was. And I think that's sort of the tragedy behind it, is that had he not gotten involved in these things, did he have the potential to be a good, great person? But that's not the path he chose, and so he continued to get corrupted by everything that was going on around him, to the point where he was unable to see his true motive, the true original motivations anymore.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder, like in some ways, I think it's interesting to, we've been talking about this as Michael's story, which obviously, is a straightforward way to approach it. And like the tragedy of, how dark Michael gets, certainly as the story continues. Like, in this movie, like, it ends with that classic shot of him closing the door on, he had married Diane Keaton at that point, right? So they were
okay.
married. Yeah. Yeah. So, but closing the door on her, which is a direct implication that he has changed, because, we're mostly introduced to his character when he's talking to her before they're married, by basically trying to, like, he doesn't really like criticize so much as he sort of soft sells what his family does as distinct from, but I'm not involved with that, and, you know, better to not talk about it, that sort of thing, right? But then to be on the other side of that door from her at the end, right?
Right, to mirror the opening of the movie, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and so, but the in some other ways, though, I think it's just as easy to talk about both one and two. And, to be honest, I'm not sure I've ever seen all of three. I don't even know. I'm not sure it's necessarily important to be considering in this regard. But in some ways, I think that the tragedy ultimately, the figure that I see as ultimately a more tragic figure, is Marlon Brando's character, Don Corleone. Because well, I guess technically he's Don Corleone while he's alive, and then Michael becomes that. That's like how the title works, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So in any case, because both in part one and part two, what we see is him doing, so Vito, right?
Yep.
So him doing what he thinks he needs to do to kind of survive and then provide for his family, right? And he tries to do it as much as he can with a bit of a code, a bit of a sense of honor, and like this idea. I mean, because what gets him killed is that well, gets him, shot anyway, is this refusal to involve the business in drugs, narcotics, right? And, so he's trying to maintain this code, and it's him that this idea that Michael shouldn't be involved with this, that point of view in the movie comes from Vito, right? He's the one that didn't want Michael involved. So to some extent, we're not even necessarily sure how much of that desire not to be involved even comes from Michael, as much as for Vito, the idea that Michael doesn't have to be involved is a dream. It's an ideal. It's a goal. And he's distraught when he realizes that Michael has been pulled into it, right? And that ultimately, with Michael taking over, any dream of this idea of this nobility, this code of ethics, this honor to it kind of just falls away. And so this idea that you can get involved with this sort of crime and violence while maintaining that honor is ultimately a failure.
Right. So the only thing that I think maybe is a little different to me from what you kind of illustrated is that I do feel like the movie shows us that Michael doesn't want to get involved, but it does it in a more complicated way than
Mm-hmm.
Michael stating that he doesn't want to get involved. It does
Okay.
it via Fredo and Carl's insistence and desire to always want more things to do. And
Yeah.
so it's like that juxtaposition of like he's not asking for these things, so we are left with the impression, like we're meant to be left with the impression that he's not actively trying to pursue it. Now, again, whether it's because it was his dad's wish or because it was his own desire, I think is left up there. But I think that's the point: is that it's not trying to give us an overt motivation for why Michael doesn't want to get involved. It's
Mm-hmm.
leaving it somewhat ambiguous, but it is showing us that he doesn't have the same desire that these other two family members definitely have.
Well, that's true, and so and again, like when I talk about like I think to go back to the Walter White comparison, I think one of the reasons that I really liked Breaking Bad in a way that I feel like I can't fully commit to The Godfather is partly that while I think it's interesting to watch this character, turn dark and then ultimately fall. Although I guess Michael doesn't really ever fall. I mean, in any kind of a like success or failure way, right? It's all just like increasingly, uh, deplorable actions. But like, I don't even remember. Does he get killed or anything in three? I literally don't even know what the story is in three.
No, his daughter or granddaughter eventually gets killed, and that's sort of the climax of it.
Mm.
But it's so bad because it's played by Sofia Coppola,
Mm-hmm.
who while has turned out to be a very talented director, is not a great actress, and so that character, it's meant to be this like really passionate, ending, and it's so hammed up that it loses all of its like. So I don't. That's why I can't even remember like what her relation was to him, because it's ultimately not as impactful as it was meant to be.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
But I think part of what is so interesting about the dynamics in Breaking Bad is that Walter White is not doing all this alone, right? Like there's his family, but more importantly, there's Jesse, right? Because as much as Jesse certainly does also lots of awful things, I think that as we lose sympathy for Walter White, we increasingly transfer it to Jesse. And by the end, what we're rooting for, at least for me, was that Walter White eventually needs to get what's coming to him, but we want Jesse to get away and be okay.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like what, for me, Godfather is missing is a Jesse character. As Michael gets worse and worse, who do I root for? Who do I care about? And again, like this all should be in the perspective of, um, this in the perspective of saying it's a very good movie, and we wouldn't. And I'm only talking about these very esoteric reservations, but we can also like maybe once we get through this bit, talk about like all of the things that it just unambiguously does extremely well.
Right. And so, well, and one that I think we assuming we'll get to, but is part of where again I think it differs, at least for me, is that like I'm always still kind of rooting for Michael, and that's what makes it hard. That's what makes the movie hard and tragic. And so, for example, the one of the scenes that it does unambiguously well, in my opinion, is the baptism scene,
Mm-hmm.
where he closes out all the loose ends, and you're sort of like rooting for him to do all of that, because those were all the people, and you like love how it came together, like the fact that it's like told in this way of like, oh, here are all the things he needed to clean up, and here was his plan to make it all happen, and you're kind of like, and then you have to take a gut check and be like, wait, why did I just root for that stuff to happen? Like,
Yeah.
And for me, that's what makes the movie powerful is
Oh
that
yeah.
I'm
I'm,
still rooting for Michael. I'm disappointed in him, and I'm disappointed in what's happened to him. And every time that he does something successfully, like I have these dueling emotions, and that's what I've always liked about it.
well, yeah. So I guess maybe what it just comes down to is I feel the same way, except I don't like it.
Right.
So because just like there's this whole theory about film that you can't it like that it's impossible to make an anti-war movie because simply depicting war on the screen is inherently glamorizing, right? Like there's this theory, and we could debate how true that is. We could say that it's at least partly true, right? While we might be able to discuss whether there are exceptions or not, but in general, it's exciting to show these battles on screen, even if the intent of the story is that war is bad, right? And
Yep.
in that same regard, when we're following Michael's story, we are placed in his shoes, and his ability to pull off that complicated plan. I absolutely agree with you. There's a part of me that is swept up with the story and excited to see him succeed at this complicated plan and win the victory that he's looking for. But when that's over, I look back and I feel gross about that. And while I can accept that maybe to some extent that's the movie's intention,
Yes. At least that's
well,
my yeah.
and I agree, but I don't enjoy having felt that way, and so like there are some movies that can deal with those complicated feelings without necessarily making me feel implicit or complicit. Um, and I don't know, like again, and it's all just relative to other great movies.
Yeah.
But the other thing is though, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, certainly not yours, but I feel like the way that people talk about this movie a lot, they don't talk about the complexity of those feelings. They talk about how cool it is, the coolness of the mafia, and they get to do whatever they want, and like it's like the Goodfellas vibe, right? They romanticize this idea of what the mafia was like, and that's the part they like, and they seem to just ignore the morally gray pieces of it, because it sounds like what they actually want is to be free of the constraints of normal legal society and to be able to just kind of do whatever they want because it's a different code that they're more okay with.
Yes. I agree that that exists. I'm not. It's definitely not how I feel about it. Not why. And it's part of why I like this movie so much. And another movie I think that is maybe even more dramatic in that effect is Fight Club.
Yeah, no, I 100%.
Um, where the whole point of the first half of the movie is to lead us to the dystopia of the second half, but
Mm-hmm.
everybody thinks the first half is so cool, but that's the point. Like it's
Yeah.
meant to be cool. Like you're supposed to be like, oh yeah, that seems really cool, but oh yeah, here are the repercussions to when the slippery slope happens in that kind of behavior. And
Yeah.
I feel like this is in a very similar way in that, like, yes, it's meant to be romanticized. It's meant to look cool, but then you're also supposed to take the other half of, yeah, but what at what expense?
Mm-hmm.
And I
And
think again to the movie's talent, the movie, you know, I I think it's underrated, just because of the power of the horse head scene, of like, oh well, this is kind of how we're going to open the movie and show you what these guys do, is also teeing us up for that kind of feeling because we do think that that's cool that he did that. Like, what a great message to send to the guy who was being a jerk, And then you're like, oh wait, but he actually killed a horse. That's
mm-hmm.
not that part's not cool, And then
Well, and it's
we're
also
also
is
like, Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It's also established that the reason that the guy wasn't getting the part was because he molested a young up and coming teen star that the studio had put a lot of time into and money. Now, it's also made clear that the director is also awful in the exact same way.
yeah,
But it's not like the guy we're trying to intervene on behalf of is a good guy or deserves it.
no,
In fact he's explicitly not. I mean, it's Vito doesn't actually like him very much, it seems.
no, it's just that, yeah, the code that he has to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I, I feel like that scene is basically like softening us up for the long extended thing that Michael's about to go through, where you're going to be rooting for him, but you're going to be sad and not
Mm-hmm.
feel like what you're rooting for is the right thing. And again, that's what I think is the power of the movie. I mean, I think that scene, is probably, obviously I think the baptism scene is the number one for me.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously the imagery of the horse head is powerful.
Yeah.
Um, and so that I think that's number two, because it's again, like, this movie is very bookmarked, bookended, sorry, bookended, not bookmarked. In that, we have the opening of Don Corleone in his office, taking requests.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have his first, our introduction to what his power is and what he can do to make things happen, and how he can go farther than the normal constraints would take us, but it's not really a great thing to do. And then that's the baptism scene, is like kind of the other bookend of that. And like, yeah, you're like, oh, what a cool plan, but he didn't really just kill a bunch of people because he didn't agree with them and they were coming after him.
Mm-hmm.
And then the door closes on him in the office at the end. So it bookends Michael and Vito as essentially the same person crafted by this world,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but doesn't take away their agency in it
Yeah.
either. And that's again the layers that this story has. That's why
Yeah.
it's so good to me.
Well,
And that you agree it's good, and so
oh
again,
yeah.
on that, but
Yeah, so I definitely agree it's good. It's a very good movie. But like I said, this is why I have reservations nonetheless. It's not one of my favorites. But I just to circle back to that point we were just talking about with the idea of glamorizing like this violent lifestyle of the mafia and the way some people do, and like Fight Club, and in the chat, Arkle Studios suggests it's like also American History X, where there are people who just are really excited by the first half, which is almost like a even more extreme example, right? But the I think to some extent with something like The Godfather, there's nothing necessarily. It's not inherently a moral hazard to have a little bit of escapism into the idea of a world where that type of mafia could exist, and imagining yourself as part of it, and there being some elements of power fantasy or escapism in there. Like, it's not inherently bad to enjoy some of that. And I wouldn't want anyone to think that I'm criticizing the very concept of that. But I think it's also important to be able to be mindful about that, and to be able to not necessarily draw the line, but be able to understand the difference between the fantasy of it and the reality of it, right? And that's where, like, it's the same way with Fight Club, that I think there are some people who seem like they want to model their whole life around the first half of that movie. And at that point you kind of want to say, oh no, please don't do that. No, 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 don't do that. But I think it's fair to ask, with Fight Club as an example, there are so many people, the sort of people who cite Fight Club as one of their favorite movies, there's so many of them who fall into that category of they only really seem to ever think or talk about that first half and how cool it is. And then the rest of it's kind of an afterthought or acceptable like because even that one, even though it sort of tries to show the consequences of it all by the end, with blowing up the banks and everything, like there's a mindset where like people are like watching that happen and say, "Good, that's good that it happened." So it is actually all good. And so I think it's fair to ask the question, if that was not Fight Club's intended message, is that an artistic failing of the movie that so many people take that away?
I mean, I don't. I it's complicated, and I don't. I don't want to get into a huge argument about Fight Club, right?
Sure.
Because Fight Club is. I mean, Fight Club's on my bookshelf right now. I mean, it's one of my favorite
I
of all time, and so I guess what I'll say is maybe because maybe they didn't going into it did not understand that people would react so strongly to the beginning. I know the
mm-hmm.
intention of the movie was that you do react strongly. Like even I, who I feel like take the correct message from the story, that's the point of the story to me is like, yeah, that's sort of this weird fantasy. It would be cool to be free of all of this like,
Mm-hmm.
consumerism and this and get back to being, real or whatever. I mean, the whole point, you can kind of summarize it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and then the idea being, but no, you have to be like, in order to actually live like that, you have to be so disassociated from reality that you create another person.
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I've always taken the right thing from it, but the fact that so many people don't maybe is an unintended consequence of how well they did at the beginning of the movie. And the book is a little different. I mean, the story is the same. I mean, it's identical. But it's because it's in writing, it's a little bit more of a slow burn. You don't come out and just get an hour of this hyper masculine anti-consumerism.
You don't have Brad Pitt being that cool on screen.
Right. It does still feel cool what they're doing in the first half of the book,
Mm-hmm.
but the degradation into this sort of nihilistic, disassociated, schizophrenic part is more natural. And I think the movie, maybe by trying to have the big reveal and tell that in a dramatic way, um, maybe that's why I said maybe
Mm-hmm.
is my answer. Misfired on how much people would just sort of kind of,
Right.
again,
Well,
but it's also kind of the point of the movie is that the people who are doing that are sort of disassociating themselves with the other part of the movie.
yeah, I think it that is a movie that's just sort of an example of something that I think is an interesting discussion ultimately about like what are the ethical responsibilities of art, you know?
Yeah.
And
Well, and I've always thought, just as a real quick aside, is that American Beauty was almost trying to remake that idea
hmm,
in a way that was a little bit less, you know, glamorous. Um, which of course is the irony is that the fact that Kevin Spacey played the character makes it even more, um, kind
yeah.
of.
Well, it's I haven't watched or even really thought about American Beauty in a long time. I think I think to my mind, American Beauty, and not just because of Kevin Spacey, I feel like the message of it hasn't necessarily aged very well. Because again, it's like on the one hand, we can see the appeal in wanting to sort of check out of the do everything by routine just because they tell you to, and being able to be a little bit more free from the obligations of this that the society forces on you. And like you can understand the appeal of that, but I feel like ultimately, other than manufacturing a reason for him to get shot, the movie does not really meaningfully explore the actual consequences of doing that.
That's fair. Yeah. I guess my point in comparing them was that his transition into that sort of disruptor
Hmm.
is less glamorous while still appealing.
Well,
You know,
it's glamorous targeted towards an entirely different audience, right? It's glamorous to the 40 somethings who work in an office as opposed to the 20 somethings who feel like, they don't have a future.
yeah.
So in any case, we've kind of ventured a little bit far afield. I think some of what we've,
Led into that with I didn't want to get into the huge thing about Fight Club because I could
well,
talk about it forever because
yeah.
that
Well,
I have
but I think that it is a meaningful conversation in the context of The Godfather, because although I don't think it's as extreme as is that, like, I think those are examples of something where, like, mafia movies essentially became like a genre, right? Where, you know, I guess gangster movies had always existed, like since since movies have been around, but they were kind of permanently changed after The Godfather came out, right? And I don't know. I guess maybe part of this is just me projecting that my feelings of discomfort with even any it's again it's just a little bit of a feeling like I can see that the movie is intending to provoke feelings of ambivalence and ambiguity, in the sense of making us cheer for Michael's plan to work, even as we realize that he is, um, he is murdering a bunch of people to solidify his power base at the same time that he's standing in a church pledging to God to look over the moral development of this infant, right? And how like hypocritical and hollow all that is for him, right? So like I can see that the movie is doing that, but it again just becomes a question of, but I feel like it's better at showing how cool it is than it is about. I don't know. Maybe this is like I said. I'm just projecting because I sort of just watch it and I feel like I resent the movie a little bit for making me root for him. Like inherently, it's well made enough and it's good enough at storytelling that I am brought in. But once the movie releases me at the end, I resent it a little bit. Does that
fair.
make sense?
It makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I feel like I've made my point as to kind of how I see it differently.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some of the stuff it does really, really well.
The horse head scene. I almost wanted to get into this back when you mentioned it earlier, but like obviously it's so iconic. I will mention that I want to roll my eyes a little bit at like some of the trivia around that scene, because one of the things that seems pretty clearly true is that they used an actual horse head, not like a prop. But like some of the things where you see people talking about that imply, oh, and they swapped it out without the actor knowing, so when he reveals it, his screams are real. And I'm like, no, no, I don't believe that. I believe he's an actor and he's trying to act like his screams are real and he's good at it. And so, like, the idea that suddenly he was surprised and just, like, I don't know. I feel like all of those anecdotes where they try to make it sound like it reminds me of the same whole thing about in Casablanca of like, oh, did she really not know how it was going to end through the whole movie? And I'm like, no, that's not what she said in the interview. What she said in the interview is that she's playing a character who is not sure who she's in love with, which is different than saying, I don't know how the movie's going to end.
Right.
So, but that said, certainly it's, the movie obviously leaves it entirely unclear, like just the mechanics of how they not only got onto this guy's estate, slaughtered his favorite racehorse, carried the head all the way up into his bedroom, and put it under the covers, with only getting blood under the covers, without him waking up. No, but that's fine. I'm not complaining. I'm just amused that, like, the reveal is so effective that I'm definitely not complaining about it. I'm saying it's the right call for the movie to not show all of that, because that would have undermined the power of pulling away the covers and seeing the head, right?
Right. The point is that they're so good at this that they can do it. You don't need to see how they did it. They just can do it. You know.
Um, in the chat, we've got someone had a 100 on their sneak skill, which I think is Skyrim, probably, right? That specific reference, but certainly it could be any of those types of games. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, the implication I think that's left sort of off screen is that it's Luca Brasi that did that part, right? I mean, I don't think we had Tom in there with a machete.
No. Yeah, Luca Brasi did it.
Yeah. Hmm.
That Tom was the face and Luca Brasi was the
Right.
muscle. For that quote. Yeah.
You know, I want to say actually that Robert Duvall as Tom is probably, for me, the closest to a Jesse character, in the sense that he is the one that, out of everybody here, maybe Vito, does actually seem to have at least some degree of a moral core to him, even though his loyalty to the family sometimes overrides whatever he personally thinks is the right thing. Like, that is the highest virtue above any other consideration. And so there are times, though, where you see him reacting to what everyone else is planning to do and kind of just go, "Oh, well, oh, all right, here, okay, here's what I will try to do to support you." But you can see him kind of wincing a little bit in some scenes, I think, like, but to some extent, he also has the benefit of being part of the family, but at arm's length, right? Like, he's not by blood, and he's German Irish instead of Italian, and so there's an extent to which he is only going to be allowed in just so far. So to some extent, that keeps him able to keep his hands clean in a way that the others can't. Like, they won't let him be the one to get his hands dirty. He's the one that goes in and talks pretty, and then someone else does the dirty part. But yeah, I like him.
Yep.
But yeah, let's talk about the iconic, beginning sequence with the wedding and everything, because the first line of dialogue is not any of the other characters, right? It's a speech from the Undertaker, right?
Yep.
Funeral director guy, and he talks about this whole I believed what they told me about what America is and what it can be and what it means to live here under the rules that they say they have. But here's how all of that failed me. And now that I've been, let down by this system that I believed in, I'm coming to you for help. And it starts to reveal some of the mechanics of this whole system, because this is where Vito goes on to make it clear that, like, the big currency in this ecosystem is loyalty, right? This promise of loyalty, and he's kind of just saying, like, you kept me at a distance before. You didn't invite me over for dinner. You didn't indicate in any way that you wanted to be a part of what I do. Um, but now that you need something, you come to me. And so, just making it clear, there's an element to where he's saying, I'm going to help you, but things will be different once I do.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Goodfellas with it's shoot. I'm combining different. Yeah, well, I guess the protection rackets of once you accept their help, now they can do whatever they want to your restaurant, and they start using it as a front for everything else, and you have to just let them do it, and then eventually when they decide it's time to burn your place down, you don't have a choice. And so that's kind of some of how that works. But in this case, because we see this dignity with Marlon Brando, his portrayal, right? We see the code in action, right? Like, so the idea that there is this code of what the mafia is all about, it's all Marlon Brando, right? Like, he's the one that sets it all up and shows the idea of what is the ultimate dream that you would aspire to in this sort of system is to be the one who sits behind the desk in the cool suit, and everybody's coming to you for help because you're the one that with the power that can get it done. And all you ask for, because you're benevolent, is that they give you the appropriate respect. And when we see him behind that desk, we see like, oh yeah, we get it. That looks very cool. And we also see, at least in part one, we don't have to see him being the one to do the dirty work, right? We see in part two that Vito did have to do some of that stuff on the way up, but ultimately, like, the idea is you rise to this point where, you don't have to carry a gun around because you got other people to do that for you. And then, like, all of this classic, iconic stuff from this movie, so much of it centers around Marlon Brando's character, and his the kind of the affected voice that he does, all of his little mannerisms, his cotton in his cheeks, jowls, and like, it's so iconic that, again, it's like I said earlier, I always forget how little screen time he is in this movie. I always feel like it's more, and then when I watch it, it's like, oh yeah, it's actually that amazing opening sequence, a couple of other short scenes, then he gets shot and he's out of commission for most of the rest of the movie, and then a short scene where he is playing around in a garden and dies. And I don't want to diminish any of those scenes. It's rather the opposite, that I want to elevate that, like, the scenes that he's in are so powerful that it seems like a bigger part of the movie than if you just are tracking screen time.
Yes. So, I agree.
So you want what's another part that you really love?
I was actually going to say, I think I've sort of talked about my favorite scenes. The Orset is obviously powerful. I really, really like, the whole scene, and not. I know we talked about the sort of the ending of Michael killing the policeman, the corrupt policeman, and then having to go to Italy, but the whole lead into that scene, and again, it does such a good job of, like, that Michael's going to kill these people, but so far in this movie, they have been constructed as, well, they're the bad people, because he's the cop that wanted to kill Michael's father, or set it up where Michael's father could get killed.
Yeah.
And the drama of the way that, they They don't, they're trying to figure out what restaurant it's going to be at. They're trying to figure out how to get the gun there. They're trying to figure out how to get Michael, to be able to do all of this stuff. And then Michael's entire, like, we're so focused on Michael that whole time, like, they're having a conversation with him and the camera just lingers on him because it's like in a situation where any of us have been in where there's something else on our mind, but we're in this social setting. And the way that it kind of makes you feel like you're there in his headspace
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
Um, and
I,
then,
yeah. No, I was going to go to another.
So yeah, if you
Yeah,
want to.
sure. I'm just thinking again still about this possible framing of thinking of it all as like the tragedy of Vito Corleone rather than Michael, in the sense that we see everything he tried to build, but then like let's look at his children, right? Like the ones that he hoped would continue on, right? Like we have Sonny, who's nominally the one who's supposed to inherit everything, right? But we see relatively early in the movie that he seems like, oh, sure, yeah, whatever it takes. And he's on board with, like, oh, hey, these guys say they want, there's a lot of money in the drugs, and, they're going to be pretty pissed at us if we don't do it. So we got to do it, right? And it's like Vito that's having to say, no, we don't like it anyway. But then we also see that, like, Sonny maybe does have some of the qualities that could make him a good leader, but he's also such a hothead that ultimately, like, that's how they manipulate him. He is so transparent in his behavior that they're able to manipulate him with a relatively little amount of pressure on, sister-in-law or brother-in-law, right?
Carl.
Yeah, to they're relatively they're able to manipulate him into not being careful and setting him up to get killed. And so, there's Sonny, who embodies this idea of like the impulsive hot-headedness, right? And then you have Fredo, who is like the other end of the spectrum. He's the one that like he loves his family. He's ambitious, but there's something just kind of craven and people pleasing about him. He's just not really able to deliver at the level that he wants to and senses that and is all the more needy as a result. And you could sort of see that as being, like when we look at how Vito reacts to like the actor who starts to cry when he's asking for help, right? It's, we could see perhaps Fredo represents everything that Vito kind of fears, like that, like that's the opposite of what I want to be. And to have Fredo be so much like that is, would be, a disappointment to him. And then we have Michael, who in some respects seems like he's the good one. He's the one that doesn't have all of these flaws. And so he's the one that we're going to try to elevate. And he's a war hero now. And maybe he's going to be the one that can be the best of all of us. But then ultimately what's kind of revealed is that he's kind of hollow inside. He does not display these other flaws because there's not as much of that normal human emotion going on inside. Maybe.
Yeah.
That's one interpretation anyway.
Yep. So.
But yeah, so we didn't really talk about like Sonny at all. I mean, James Caan, I think, is great in the role, although certainly there's an element to which like he is so extreme in wanting to beat the crap out of brother-in-law for abusing his wife, but he's not exactly, he's no angel himself.
Right.
So it's again, it's a lot of this sort of you know do as I say, not as I do. Not even that. It's more as like I get to do whatever I want, and you have to do what I say.
Yes.
Right. That's definitely kind of Sonny's whole thing.
Yeah. No. Exactly. I think that's sort of his character is meant to be oh, if you follow this glamorization of you can do whatever you want to the extreme, this is who you end up.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. Um, one of the uh, one of the scenes that I think is another just really effective scene is the scene where Luca Brasi is killed. Now I understand that there's a whole lot of stuff relating to his character that's in the book that's not really in the movie, and like I think there's I don't want to necessarily get into that. I'm mostly just talking about like how that scene develops and how everything is simultaneously so orchestrated and so sloppy and messy, and like so many of the deaths in this movie are like that in a way that I think is really interesting and purposeful, I'm sure, in terms of how they're depicted, because even though they clearly set up all of this stuff, they have a guy waiting behind him with the Garrett wire. They have the guy behind the bar with the knife. They're clearly teaming up to try to manipulate him into the position where they can do what they need to do. But it's still this like falling to the ground struggle between these two guys, and it's all sort of messy and sloppy when it happens. And then it's the same when they go and they kill the guy in the car in the cornfield, and um, leave the gun, take the cannoli, and that whole bit, right? Um, there was a moment watching this because I hadn't seen it in a while where I kind of forgot that line was from that scene, and for some reason I had been thinking that it was associated with the scene where Michael shoots the guys. Like he's at the restaurant and they order cannoli or something. He's supposed to leave the gun and take the cannoli, but obviously that's wrong. It's just a crossed wire in my own head. Yeah.
I think to your point that that is one of the things the movie does really well. Also, is that the orchestration of the death scenes is the interesting part.
Mm-hmm.
The execution is always so just grotesque and sloppy
Mm-hmm.
because you're killing people. I mean, and I think it really hammers that point home. To your point, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Um, I think one of my favorite scenes, so many of my favorite scenes in this movie really are associated with, Marlon Brando's character and his performance. Like, after Sonny is killed, the payoff to the thing from the beginning where, the Undertaker is, one of these days may call upon you for a favor and that sort of thing, and then paying that off with, look at what they did to my boy, I need you to help me, like take care of him. And like that's really sweet and touching. And is Marlon Brando is just amazing in it. Like
yes,
for such a guy who ultimately was so weird in many ways, he sure did do some good acting jobs.
oh yeah. So
All right, you want to talk a little bit about the awards and stuff? Because
yeah,
there's
go for it.
definitely some interesting trivia there. So, The Godfather in the 1972 Oscars won Best Picture. Marlon Brando won Best Leading Actor. Although this was the notorious ceremony where he did not attend the ceremony and instead sent Sacheen Littlefeather, a Native American actress, to go up on stage and basically say that Brando was refusing the award due to poor treatment of American Indians in entertainment and all of that stuff, and that she was not well treated. Like the Hollywood audience at that time was not receptive to that message, and him not. And in some ways, I think it's interesting to consider that while you could say that the idea of an actor or actress trying to use their Hollywood clout to try to forward a cause is there's some praise to be earned there, but the idea of sending her out on the stage instead of him when people are expecting him and all that. It's kind of a lot of pressure to put on her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But anyway, so that happened, and then it also won Best Writing Screenplay based on material from another medium, so like adapted screenplay, I guess. Although it's the title of it is different in this. But there was a bunch of nominations also. All for actor in a supporting role was James Caan, Robert Duvall, and Al Pacino. But there was also so Al Pacino didn't attend the ceremony, but because he felt like, how is Marlon Brando lead actor and I'm supporting actor when I'm in the movie way more than he is? Which, like, I mean, fair. Although to some extent, that we know that the whole thing there is that like movies shuffle that stuff around all the time based on who they think they can have win, right? Although, interestingly enough, even though 3 of the 5 nominees for Best Supporting Actor that year were from The Godfather, the winner went to Joel Grey from Cabaret, who is, the MC guy from Cabaret. And then also nominated for Best Director, Costume Design, Sound Editing, and originally nominated for Score, but then that was withdrawn because the main theme that we think of from The Godfather was actually used by the same composer in a different movie earlier. So they said, wait, you can't nominate it for Best Original Score if you've used that music before for something else. Which is an interesting nuance because like he didn't steal it from some other composer. He stole it from himself from an earlier composition. But yeah, if you pull up Fortunella, which is the other movie that had that music, you can definitely hear that melody in very clearly in that it's obviously the same. So it's just one of those things. It's like it was replaced at the last minute though, so it's one of those things where you sort of feel like how did I suppose there's not the internet now in the way that there was then, and so it's not necessarily a guarantee. Like if people hadn't seen Fortunella, but yeah, so that I think that's the awards for this one. Anything else you want to say about Godfather, or we can move on?
No, but it sounded like something fell in my other room, so I'm gonna
Okay,
look at
check on
that
that real quick. Sure.
transition. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, let's see. I will read a bit of trivia bits from IMDb while we wait. Um, this is let's see. This definitely sounds like something Marlon Brando would do. It says, during an early shot of the scene where Vito Corleone returns home and his people carry him up the stairs, Marlon Brando put weights under his body on the bed as a prank to make it harder to lift him. That's pretty funny. Although I could imagine that going wrong if he just makes them drop him down the stairs or something. Then we have the the actor who played Luca Brasi, Lenny Montana, was so nervous about working with Marlon Brando that in the first take of their scene together, he flubbed some lines. The director, Francis Ford Coppola, liked the genuine nervousness and used it in the final cut. The scenes of Luca practicing his speech were added later. I think that's really cool because that's certainly a memorable part of the movie too. The idea that this big tough guy is so nervous about meeting the Godfather that he practicing speaking in English is not his best thing, but he wanted to make a good impression. Although it's also made clear in the story, like it's not like they only just met. They've known each other for a while. He's one of his most trusted guys. So why is he so nervous? I don't know. It's fine. Talking about Luca Brasi being nervous to meet the Godfather at the beginning.
Oh yeah, doing his rehearsing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway.
So everything good? We're ready to move on?
Yeah, it was a minor thing. So
Right.
something did fall, but not. It was something I had moved to clean earlier, and it fell off of like the railing from upstairs down onto the stairs. So it sounded a lot scarier than it
Yeah.
actually was by far, but it was just a piece of workout
Sure.
equipment. Not a big deal.
All right. Well, so then let's move on to number one on the AFI's list, Citizen Kane, 1941 drama, the first film directed by Orson Welles, who also stars and wrote the screenplay. Although I guess Herman Mankiewicz also is credited now that I look at the credits on there. But like we were talking about earlier, this movie, in some respects, I think really gets looked at differently from other movies. Like it's almost like I said, it's like it's on a pedestal. Like you know, people will talk about it, but I feel like I don't see very many discussions about film where people will literally compare it directly to another movie. Like as in which movie did this better? Like I feel like it just doesn't happen. Those conversations don't happen because it's sort of just automatically assumed. Oh, by the way, let me move. Here we go. There we go. Citizen Kane. Oh, that's a hella 40s poster, though, huh?
Yeah.
Um, which I think is just interesting, just because like it is just a movie, right? It's not like it's not automatically exempt from those sorts of comparisons, except that it's certainly true that it invented a whole lot of things that became incredibly influential cinematic tools, but did it in a way that, like, there are plenty of these movies that we've watched over the list where, it did something first and gets a lot of credit for it, but it's kind of been done better since. And with maybe a few very minor exceptions in this movie, there's a lot of stuff where, like, not only did it do it first, but it's really not necessarily been obviously surpassed by other movies that have tried to copy it.
Yeah, and it did it all without like glaringly calling attention to it. Like all of the things that it sort of initiated all are packaged within the story in a way that makes them subtle, which I think is part of the genius of this movie. Is while they were doing things like let's take one of the most simplest ones, like having visible ceilings.
Mm-hmm.
You know that it doesn't call attention to the fact that you can see the ceiling, but they went through extraordinary amounts of work to make that happen in the
Mm-hmm.
way that mics and all that stuff worked at the time, that sort of set the whole industry forward. But it doesn't, there's never a time where you're like, oh, you can see the ceiling and you couldn't see the ceiling prior to this movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's not doing that. And I think that's part of the genius of it.
Yeah. And then the use of deep focus, which is something that has occasionally been used since, but is often only used for certain circumstances. Because to some extent, in a lot of movies, where the focal length is focused is literally used as part of this storytelling tool, right? Like you might have a rack focus shot where first you're looking at something in the background, but then it'll change the focus to something in the foreground, literally intending to draw the viewer's eye. So it's not like accidental, and why wouldn't you have everything in focus? But one of this movie's favorite tricks is using that deep focus to upend our perspective a little bit, like where you see a fireplace in the background, and only when you watch the character walk all the way back there, you realize, holy crap, that fireplace is 3 times bigger than it looks like at first.
Yeah.
And they do that a couple of times, but again, for storytelling purposes, it's not like just a flashy trick. Like it's all part of it. And I think what's also like it's just every level of the this movie is kind of operating on this innovative in this innovative way, because the complexity of the screenplay in terms of its structure, it was very unusual at the time, right? And it's, occasionally, there are complex structures of stories now, but just this idea of the different framing device. Like, we start with the newsreels that give us some background, but then to show that, okay, it's journalists watching those newsreels, but then having like the montage of this guy talking to all these different people. And he originally talks to what's her name early on, and she doesn't want to talk to him, but we come back later, and it just seeding all of these ideas and having the slightly Rashomon sort of effect of like the different people he talks to talk about different parts of his life, but also from their own perspective, and just the complexity of uncovering the mystery of who was Charles Foster Kane.
Right.
There's a brief hesitation there because I was like, who was, looking over on the screen, Charles Foster Kane, because I couldn't remember his first name at first. But yeah, so I think there's a big I think it's sort of fallen away because it's been supplanted by some things. But for the longest time, What is Rosebud was like the cliche movie spoiler, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that that there is one piece of information that just pokes a hole in the entire suspense of the movie. The idea Rosebud was a sled. Now, first of all, I think the movie actually like is totally able to withstand knowing that, right? Like it doesn't ruin the movie at all. But that was the classic example for the longest time, right? And I think, even though like some of the things that have come and gone since, like, Darth Vader is Luke's father, I see dead people, or rather the Sixth Sense ending, like some of these other things that are in culture as classic examples of movie spoilers, but like that one is still like people who have never seen this movie know that Rosebud is still sled,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Lots of people do.
When Abby and I were telling our neighbors that we were watching through all these movies, they said, "What's number one? Is it that movie Rosebud?" Like that, they thought the name of the movie was Rosebud because of how prevalent that is.
Yeah. I'm just suddenly flashing on. There was a classic Kids in the Hall sketch. I don't know if you've ever seen this one, but it's these just two guys are having lunch, and one of them is saying, "Oh yeah, I saw this great movie last night. Oh, I can't remember what it was called. It was all about this guy who became like a newspaper tycoon, and then he was, like a politician." And then the other guy's like, "Oh, Citizen Kane." No, no, that wasn't it. So like it shows him as a kid, and he has the sled. It's like, no, that's Citizen Kane. No, I don't think so. It's just that's the build of the scene.
Right.
But yeah, it is just this iconic thing that it's kind of amazing that it's been able to, because like even other like Casablanca, which came out the same year, I think, right? Wait, so this was 1941. Casablanca was
42.
okay. So similar time frame in any case. But the idea of like that movie is certainly a masterpiece in its own way, and we talk about it still to this day, and people love it. But Citizen Kane feels different from that, right? I think to one extent that there's probably a sense from a lot of people, even who have seen it before, that watching Citizen Kane feels more like homework than watching Casablanca.
Well, yeah, there's just because I think part of that's because there are so many things that it does that if you're trying to like study it as a film, you have to pay attention to. Like we already talked about,
Mm-hmm.
visible ceilings, deep focus, on the ground perspective is another one because the cameras didn't work the way that you can now, where you can just put the camera on the ground and point it up. You had to dig a hole if you wanted a low perspective. and so they were doing those things. Like, so yeah, it is kind of like homework if you're trying to study all of the things that it does.
Yeah.
So I get that, whether it's a criticism or acknowledgement or whatever. I think that's fair.
Hmm.
Um, I think,
See, I'm not even necessarily thinking of it like a criticism or even a compliment, as much as just what is the cultural perception of the movie as distinct from some of the others, right? I think part of it is just that there is this element where it is so well regarded and has been for so long, that there is a level of expectation, right? People feel like they're supposed to like it, as opposed to where Casablanca, where it's like, sure, you probably will like it because it's really good, but there's not this same level of, well, if you don't like it, then you're just stupid somehow, right? As opposed to Casablanca, Citizen Kane, where I think there's an element to which people sort of feel like they're judged. They'll be judged if they don't like it, and so there's a pressure on it, maybe.
yeah, it makes me sad because normally I can give the perspective of my wife watching these movies with me and having seen all of the top 20 for the first time.
Yeah.
Um, However, because she's been with her family in Georgia, she didn't watch this one with me.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't have that yet. She will watch it when we get back, but I think that would be an interesting perspective as somebody who enjoys kind of watching movies, like, and again, to watch sort of, we didn't talk about with the Godfather, but that was another one where she was just engrossed in the
Hmm.
story. Um, because I was very worried after Lawrence of Arabia when we had to watch it over like 3 or 4 nights because she
Hmm.
just couldn't get into it, which is fair.
Yeah.
I love it, but it didn't grab her in that same way.
Hmm.
And then Gone with the Wind, we watched in one night. Godfather, we watched in one night. Even though we didn't intend to, Raging Bull, another one we didn't. Schindler's List, didn't intend to watch in one night, but did.
I mean, Raging Bull's a little different, only in the sense that it's not crazy long like all of the
No,
others.
it
Yeah,
isn't. But yeah,
yeah.
don't.
Hmm.
Anyway, the point is that the rest of these movies have at least grabbed her. Like, she didn't like Raging Bull, as
Hmm.
much as some of these other ones. But this one, I will be really interested to see her perspective because my intention is to go into it and not, to your point about it being homework, not go into it like a film professor and say, oh well, you see how you can see the ceilings here? Oh, do you see how he's in the shadow and then he steps out of the shadow? Oh, do you see how it shot through the peacock's eye? Oh, do you see how like I
Yeah,
want to just let her watch the movie and take it at face value and see what she thinks, and then say, okay, here are all the reasons why it's number one.
yeah,
This is what it did that was so different in 1942 and has changed our film industry, and why and I'm even torn right now. I don't even know what I'm going to do with this movie at this point. Like, I fully intended to just put Casablanca one after watching it and just saying, I love the light. Like, again, what we talked about, that lightning in the bottle just, it
yeah,
deserves one for me. But then watching this again and seeing and remembering all of the things that this did, it's a
yeah.
good movie.
Well, it's
But
it's
what makes it a great
yeah.
movie is it just absolutely just said, what are all the rules? No, we don't care about the rules. We're going to do whatever. We're going to work as hard as possible. We're going to use every technology, and not even technologies. We're going to use manual labor to do some things. Like, we're just going to make this work in the way that we want it to work. And they
Hmm.
willed this movie to happen.
Yeah.
And it has just absolutely transitioned everything since then. So it's going to be hard to take this out of
Well,
one.
I think it comes down to, this is a quote that I mentioned when we talked about Casablanca, because Roger Ebert did a commentary on the Blu-ray for Casablanca, and one of the things that he says in that commentary is hard to argue with. And what he said is, if someone asked me what is the best movie of all time, I would probably say Citizen Kane. But if someone asked me what's my favorite movie of all time, I would say Casablanca.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the time we talked about that exact same quote after we had watched Casablanca, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, it's my list. I'm going to make that my favorite movie because it's the
Mm-hmm.
one I like the most.
Yeah.
But now having gone back and watched this, it's so hard to take this out of that spot because it it just does things that movies didn't do.
Yeah. Well, it becomes a question of how do you define what distinguishes one from two, right? How it which is better, fun or awe, right? Like which deserves to be above the other? That they're doing different things,
Yes.
and but that's of course the whole the whole list, right? One of the oh gosh, I suddenly just to complete the thought is that I think part of where this sort of broader cultural expectation comes from is that Citizen Kane, I think for a lot of people, is better known as being the number one movie of all time than it is as being itself, right? Like, what do people know about Citizen Kane? Well, there's the whole Rosebud is the sled thing, which is honestly like it. Not only is it an oversimplification of the actual issue, but like we could talk about that, but it's so trivial compared to anything else about the movie. But the idea of what does someone know about it? Well, they know that's the movie that's supposed to be the best movie of all time, right? Like they know that without even knowing anything that the movie's about,
I mean,
right?
that's my nose. They have no idea what it's about. They thought the movie was called Rosebud,
Yeah.
and they didn't know what Rosebud meant. And I didn't want to tell them because Abby was there, and I want Abby to see it because I I disagree with you in that I guess no, I don't totally disagree with you. It is trivial in compared to all the other things the movie advances. I do
Yeah.
not think it's trivial to the movie by any means.
Well, I guess maybe I was overstating what I mean by that, which is to just say I don't think that Rosebud is the sled is a magic key that just unlocks everything about the movie, right? Because
No, yeah,
yeah.
agreed.
Yeah, that's I guess what I mean is it's not like the whole movie is just a riddle waiting for the punchline, right? That's my point is that it's not like, oh well, you already know Rosebud is the sled, might as well not bother watch then, right? Like that's my point is that it's not like it's the answer that explains everything, but it is certainly meaningful in the story and to the character. It's just not like a joke and a punchline where it once you know that it everything else was just set up or something.
No, yeah, fair. No,
That's what I meant is just to say that it's not like, oh, if you know Rosebud is the sled, that means you understand the story.
no, fair. Yeah, definitely not true. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and because I think in a lot of ways the speech that the journalist makes about Rosebud at the end before we get the reveal, I think in a lot of ways is the more true answer.
Yep.
Where he's talking about like it's almost not important to know specifically what detail of his life he's referring to. It's about the longing for something lost or something that he couldn't hold on to, that sort of thing. So knowing that it was the sled specifically is less important than the emotion being expressed.
Yep.
Although it's interesting, as you rewatch, like I caught a detail this time that I hadn't ever noticed before, which is that midway through the movie, they do establish at one point that he did receive a shipment of all of the things from his mother's old cabin. And that's just like midway in the movie, and it's kind of a throwaway line that, like, theoretically, he did know in principle at some point that he had those things in crates in his possession.
Yeah, I think, but it also makes the whole point just as powerful in that, like the fact that all of the statues he was buying, he wasn't even uncrating.
Yeah.
He left
Well,
Anna Cleaner. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It like that's the watching this time. I was so affected by the the total sadness and loneliness of his existence by the end, where he's just doing all of these things by rote because he can, and none of it brings him joy anymore, and it's all hollow. And that all, like, understanding that's why that his longing for the time when he only had one possession and it was everything to him, right? As opposed to now where he has everything that anyone could want, so far beyond the point of just having those things, but to the point where, like, he couldn't, if he spent all his time doing it, even look at all of the things he owns. And yet, that's all he knows how to do anymore, is to just buy things and have them sit in crates in his enormous house. For why? For what purpose? Um, and it's interesting because there's the scene earlier. It's towards the end. It's just before his wife leaves him, where it's setting us up for that, right? Where she's doing her jigsaw puzzles and she's feeling like, I'm alone, we're not going anywhere. And he points out, like, we have no less than 50 of your friends staying in the other wing of the house. And him, like, gesturing like, doesn't that prove that you're not lonely? As he's standing over her in front of this enormous, stark fireplace and she's doing a jigsaw puzzle on the floor. Like, yeah, in theory, there's other people around that proves you're not lonely. And then they go out on this like camping trip where she's complaining, like, oh, you're going to go and force everybody to leave their comfy rooms and sleep in tents and pretend that you're doing it as a favor to them. And and again, it's all just about the trappings of the things that are supposed to be what you want, right? And I think it's when she leaves him that it's like it's certainly not the first time he faces failure, but again, it's like it's one of the times where it's what she says in that tent first, and then follows up on, which is, all you know how to do is buy things for people and buy people. But what you want is for people to love you, and the only way you know how to do that is to try to buy them. And that is never going to get you what you're actually wanting. And to have that, for her to yell it, I think he can't hear her say it when they're out in public because he's too conscious of, oh, other people are going to hear you and all of that. But then when she actually says it to him, like she's leaving and then does leave, and he has this total meltdown and throws her all the stuff around her room, leading up to spotting the snow globe, right? And I think that's just such a perfect example of the nuance and attention to detail in this movie and the layered complexity of the story, right? Because we're introduced to the snow globe almost right away, right? Because we start with am I remembering right that the pan in
He drops snow globe.
well, right, but I just mean that the literal beginning of the movie is the pan in across Xanadu, right? It's where the one lit window stays in the same place, even though we transition to closer and closer and closer. That's just such a cool sequence too, right? Panning past all of these decaying Wonderland scenes as we go into this huge dark house with just one lit window, and then of course the snow globe that he's holding, which is not what he wanted, but is close enough that it reminds him of what he doesn't have, Rosebud, and then drops it, and that's the beginning of the movie, right? And so for him to, when we see him find that at the end, just when he's kind of at that low point, where, you know, she is just for the first time in his life sized him up utterly in a way that he has no defense against to say she's wrong, right? Like, I think that's part of why he has that tantrum where he's just throwing stuff around, is because, like, he wants her to be wrong, but he can't think of how she is.
Yep.
Yeah. I so I yeah, this movie I think is really amazing. Like, it's the screenplay is so tight, and everything just leads from one thing to another, and there's so much detail, and like everything makes, you know, even though it's like we don't get it in chronological order at all, right? Because we, you know, we start with he dies, then we get the journalist sent on this job, and then he's talking to different people, because I think he goes to talk to Susan first, right? But she doesn't want to talk to him at first. And then he talks to the money guy. Thatcher, yeah. Where what he gets from that perspective is some of this, you know, childhood story, but then also we have this rapid transition where I think it would be fun to run a newspaper, and the this idea of where the money is going and how that all develops. But it's kind of striking, I think, for us to watch that sequence, because we're realizing like how much time is going by in this guy's story and how little insight to who the man is we get. But that's totally intentional, and we're in the journalist's shoes, which again, just the cleverness of the filmmaking, never showing us the journalist's face, just having him be our window into this mystery.
Yep.
You know, it's great. But so, and then we just like him going from all these different people and hearing the different versions of all of this stuff, and who knows which pieces of his life, and the way everything just flows so well, and just, you know, depicting this guy's life, because, you know, you mentioned at the beginning that there's some elements of comparison to Godfather and Citizen Kane, in the sense of someone who maybe started off with good ideals but then was ultimately kind of corrupted. I think I think that's. Do you want to talk more about that for this movie?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a little more overt in this, you know, and is called out a couple of times in the fact that, you know, like, they get so giddy and they're writing their declaration of principles because it's like, oh, I have all this money, I can do whatever I want, so I can be a guy with principles with a lot of money.
Yeah.
And that's his start. And, you know, the whole, oh, well, I'm going to lose I'm going to lose $1 million this year, I'll lose $1 million next year, and I'll lose $1 million a year after that. And at that rate, I'll go bankrupt in 50 years.
Yeah.
You know, and sort of this freewheeling, like, now that I have this money, I can do what I always thought was right, but then ultimately that ends up corrupting him. So I guess it's a little more overt in that he enters the movie with much more clear, but yeah, I saw it as the concept similar, in that you're taking a guy from the beginning who you like, and then the guy at the end you don't like, and the situation that he was involved in is what made him change to the point that you didn't like him, and that's where it's similar in that arc to The Godfather.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that is, like interesting about the transition for Kane is that it's kind of a combination of things, because on the one hand there's this idea of just power corrupting, but in some respects that's kind of not entirely the story of what happens to Kane, right? Because he has money and power to begin with, right? Like that's how he's able to do what he's doing at the beginning, is that he feels
Right.
like it's his money that allows him.
It's the working within the world
Yeah.
of money and power that ultimately corrupts him.
Well, and there's a, I think a lot of what it is for him is hubris, right? It's this belief that he should be, that money and power is what allows him to do whatever he wants, whatever he thinks is right. But then when he starts bumping up against struggles like the Great Depression, and suddenly he doesn't have that same level of money anymore, that's where he starts saying, oh, well, now I find that I am actually being interfered with. Better get more money and power. And I think that's kind of where it starts to go wrong for him, right? Like, it's not necessarily that that was when it first started, because I think to some extent, his, even when he was his at his most young and idealistic, it was still a very privileged hubristic position, because he had the money to be able to try to do whatever he wanted instead of having to work within the system like everybody else, right?
Right.
But then, all of a sudden he discovers, oh, wait, it is possible for the outside world to interfere with me. So I have to stop them from interfering with me. But even at the beginning, we see that his desire to do be this big idealistic guy is rooted in this desire of, well, that's how I get people to love me, right? Because his declaration of principles is a big front page thing that he signs his name to, right? So it's not just about having principles, it's about seeing it, being seen as having principles, right? So it's like,
Yeah, no, it's
yeah. So, I mean, I think ultimately that is, like where he fails ultimately is the very normal, understandable, sympathetic desire to be loved, but due to his upbringing, having very little in the way of understanding of how to achieve that, because the money and power kind of makes it easy to try to have that be the way. But ultimately that doesn't work, and he just keeps trying harder and harder because that's all he knows how to do. But it's still all coming ultimately from this, inside is this lonely little boy who had something that was meaningful once, and then it was taken away from him by all of this money and power. Although there's some interesting nuance too, even in that scene with his parents and all of that, because it's such an amazing reversal in that scene, where we start with it looking like his mother is cold and almost inhuman, and she's got all this money and she's going to send her kid away, and it sounds in that moment like she's awful. She just doesn't want to have a kid. She's sending him away now that she can afford to do that. And we have the dad in the background seeming very human and like, well, hey, how come I don't have a say in this and everything? And it's this portrayal of those two parents, but then later, at the end of the scene, she's like, "That's right. I'm sending him away so you'll never be able to touch him again." And this implication that she is getting him away because the father is abusive, maybe. And I think that's such an interesting way to spin the scene, to just have us sort of like reverse our perception of who his parents are right at the end of the scene.
Right. No, I think that's another example of a great scene. So
But it also just goes to show this element of, you know, poor kid, you know, not to say he never had a chance, because there are plenty of people who do have really hard upbringings and then do grow up to be healthy people that don't have to amass billion-dollar empires in order to try to fill the hole inside. But we do see the origin of this need in him is that the only people who show him affection do it as the flip side of an abusive coin, and the people who do care about him more are the ones that tend to be more cold and withholding. And so, how does a kid who grows up that way, how do they try to approach the loneliness they feel inside that everyone feels sometimes. So, yeah. So it's so good. It's very good. It's a good movie. People should watch it. If anyone has been listening to this and like still has not seen it, and it's just one of those movies that's always been kind of on the list of like, yeah, I guess I should see it, but it feels like it should be homework or whatever. Like it's extremely watchable. It when you just put it in, it's not a slog like some movies can be. Like, I talk about 2001 and how much I absolutely adore it, but I am also very cautious when I recommend it to people, because you approach that one with the wrong state of mind and you're going to be bored stiff. Because I think it's great, but has some very things about it that make it hard to watch if you're not kind of in the right mindset. Whereas Citizen Kane is actually, I think, very easy to watch. It flows very naturally. It's not boring. It keeps trucking along. It's very good. It's a great movie, no question.
yeah,
But
and like I said at the beginning, I mean that's part of what makes it so good is that it took a very easy script, easy watchable movie, and just layered this density of production that it was I almost want to say unnecessary at the time, but because you could have told the story without all those things.
mm-hmm.
But it's what elevates it to the point where it's at is that the fact that they said, well, these things aren't necessary, but these are what we want to do to make this movie the best that it can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, like I said, we talked about, yes, there can be some homework to it. And if you actually want to go through every single thing that they did that was brand new, that can be a list of homework, But the movie didn't use them as, oh, here's our opportunity to showcase all of these things we can do. It was like, here's the story we want to tell,
Mm-hmm.
and here are all the tools that maybe we haven't used as effectively as we could have that we can now apply to this movie.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it good.
So some of the just little bits and bobs around the margins of the movie's existence, as opposed to in the movie itself, are interesting, because, of course, it's a fictionalized story based on a real guy that they're like it's not subtle who they're talking about, because William Randolph Hearst is a real person who this movie is not shy about saying, oh, no, Charles Foster Kane is absolutely supposed to be William Randolph Hearst. There's no subtlety about it, really. But so it's interesting, because, like, this is obviously not intending to be a true story, but it is absolutely intended to be an indictment of William Randolph Hearst as a person.
Yes.
Which, of course, made Hearst not like the movie very much, um, as people might imagine. So there's some fun stuff around the the marginalia there that we don't have to get into all the history of it. But I think there's also just like Orson Welles is just such an interesting person. Like he just did so much stuff, and there's like a lot of like classically famous artistic people, like these multi-talented individuals like this. There's always this dynamic of like the thing I was trying to get around to talking about is the credit card for him at the end, where he makes a big deal about showing all of these cards for like the directors, the like the cinematographer and all of these other stars, and like he's doing all of these big credits, and then his own is just like at the very bottom of the rest of the supplemental cast, is his own name. And so it's one of those things of like modesty but faux modesty, but then kind of back around again to real modesty.
It's hard to tell. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because of course it's easy for him to put himself down that low because he's so front and center as part of the movie that like it draws attention to itself being there, as opposed to like an actual like, oh well, but I am just one of the players. And but at the same time choosing to focus on all of the other people that were a part of the production, like that's how putting more focus on their names in the credits, like that's actually meaningful. Yeah. He's making it clear that even though he's being a little cheeky with it by putting his name so small at the end like that, is that he's also highlighting that there were actually a lot of other people involved with the movie and that they had important contributions too. And that's a little bit like how, even before making this movie, he used to be involved with like radio production companies and stuff like that. Yeah. So, I don't know. Ready to adjust the list?
Yeah, I'm gonna run to the restroom real quick while
Okay.
you can
All
wrap
right.
up. You can do the awards, and
Okay.
I'll be back.
Yeah. So, this movie was not as rewarded by the Oscars as some are, and especially considering its, place at the apex of the AFI's list here. But it did win Best Original Screenplay. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor in a Leading Role, Orson Welles, Best Director, Orson Welles, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, Best Sound, Best Film Editing, and Best Music. So it was nominated for all of those things, but didn't, win all of them. So let's see. I'm going to look up here. So Orson Welles didn't win, but the best actor went to Gary Cooper from Sergeant York, which is, Gary Cooper, obviously a classic Hollywood actor. He's good, but like, I never saw Sergeant York. It's not, so it's like, do these movies stand the test of time as much? Maybe not as much. Let's see, what was Best Picture that year? It's so weird to sometimes the IMDb things, when you're trying to look at what, the other winners were that year, you end up having to scroll like 2/3 of the way down the list to get to Best Picture. But the winner was How Green Was My Valley, which is, I've heard of it, but probably only in context of it winning the Best Picture over Citizen Kane.
Right.
It might be good. I've never actually seen it.
Yeah, my reaction is the meme of what WUT.
Yeah. Well, I think that, one of the things that I think is true about Citizen Kane is that in some respects, it may have been ahead of its time, right? Like it was so innovative that I think there were probably a lot of people who kind of watched it and was like, what is this? I don't understand this yet. Like it's a little bit too much, maybe. for some of the audiences at the time, and it like took realizing how effective some of those things were. It was too new, maybe, for some people. But yeah, so let's talk about the list. Do you know
Okay.
where you want to put things?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the hardest ones, but I I feel like and it's part of why we do this.
Mm-hmm.
After watching it again, I I got to leave Citizen Kane at one. Um, there's too much to it.
Mm-hmm.
There are too many layers that as much as I wanted Casablanca to be number one, like I can't bring myself to do it.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna drop Godfather 2, 3, put Casablanca at two, and I'm good.
All right. That
And I feel
is.
like I already made my case for why Godfather should be this
Oh,
highest.
sure. Well, no, you know what? We talked about Godfather already. It's clear.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I'm just kind of noting that on the spreadsheet, despite it being a very simple move, it's actually just as hard to do the shifting around of the different cells. Um, moving it just one spot doesn't actually make it easier than moving it 15 spots when you're just copying and pasting on a spreadsheet and so on. Yeah, so I'm going to move Godfather further down. I think I'm going to put it, let's see. I am going to put it, um, I feel like it's not an obvious comparison, but what my gut is telling me is to put it between Sunset Boulevard and the Maltese Falcon, which is at about like 29 or 30. Um, which again is like, serious respect for like all of the filmmaking elements of it, and even a very well told story, but just one that doesn't move me as much as some others. Um, but like you, I'm also going to leave Citizen Kane where it is. And it's on the basis of, we talked about that quote of like, even if I think Casablanca is the movie that is like, a comfy sweater and a mug of hot cocoa on a cold day, it's pure comfort and entertainment. It's so makes me so happy. But it is also Citizen Kane is more important, I think. So when we're talking about like what are the metrics that you use to determine the rank on the list, how much they are sheerly entertaining is certainly one factor, but not the only one. And Citizen Kane is extremely high on so many of these other metrics in terms of standing the test of time, being influential on other things, and all of that. And it's also entertaining. So yeah, I am also leaving that at number one. And so that actually means that we have a fair amount of alignment on. Oops, I did the wrong thing there. We both have Citizen Kane as number one. We both have Casablanca as two. You have Godfather at three, which I have lower down, but otherwise we both then have. So I have Lawrence of Arabia and Star Wars at 3 and 4, whereas you have them at 4 and 5 because Godfather is higher. And that's where our list actually starts to diverge a little bit more. But we both have Schindler's List relatively high, um, and after that it starts to diverge a lot more. But yeah, so we did it. We watched 100 movies.
We did.
Yeah. So the question then becomes, what next?
Let's watch
Um,
more.
yeah. So one of the things that we talked about a couple of different ways that we might uh, we could theoretically approach going forward, but at least for this time, maybe we should just each of us suggest one movie to watch and then we will watch those two movies and discuss them. It might have been easier if we had talked about this in advance, so we could have both had
Yes.
our movie ready to go. But yeah, and so I would encourage, as we start, not merely for this time, but even future ones, I would encourage us to maybe think of this not only as like what movie should have been on this list, but like what movie would be on your personal list, like just as a favorite, or it could even just be a movie that you want to talk about more, or like I feel like moving forward, the justification for what movie to discuss and talk about, I think, free game,
Right. We
whatever you
can watch
feel.
100 more movies.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There are way more than 100 more movies that theoretically would be fun to watch and talk about. But what I'm just saying is, I don't think that we have to choose our next movies on the basis of, well, I think that the AFI should have included movie X on it, right? It could instead be a movie that you just personally really like and want to talk about.
Yeah. Um, I'm thinking through it. Gladiator is a potential.
Hmm? It's been a long time since I've seen that one.
And the only reason it comes up is because we've talked about other movies that, again, started certain things that I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that movie has kind of, in the modern times, I don't want to say taken what those other movies have done,
Mm-hmm.
but as far as modern times, that movie has definitely done it. Um, The Departed is actually one that came up the other day
Mm-hmm.
that I hadn't thought about in a long time. And I was like, you know what? Like, as far as like tight storytelling and conflicted emotions, that movie's pretty good. Um, Another one that came up was because me and my friends were kind of going through this
Mm-hmm.
Slumdog Millionaire, but that's not an American film, so it
Well,
doesn't.
let's just briefly talk about that. Do we want to continue to limit ourselves to American films? I'm not sure that we should necessarily. Right? Like we can talk about any kind of movie we want. We could talk about foreign
Well,
language films or
yeah, so we're
other
gonna start
productions.
using like Spirited Away.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's funny.
Pan's Labyrinth. Um,
It's funny you mentioned
Lost.
Spirited Away because that was absolutely one on my short list.
And so here's a I don't want to say it's a wild card, but this was one that somebody threw at me that I kind of had to think about. The Dark Knight.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a cute, like, as the third movie in a trilogy.
Well, Dark Knight was two, right? Batman Begins, Dark Knight, Dark Knight Rises.
Oh yeah, sorry. Maybe it was Dark Knight Rises that we are talking about, but I guess both of those two. Then I mean, the fact that those two movies sort of they didn't change Batman. It was a hard conversation. I don't want to get into it too much because I think if we watched them, it would be good. I mean, maybe that's a sequence right there. Is that we watch the Christian Bale Batmans and talk about the transitions. Like I
Well,
mean
yeah,
that's
that's a
one
good point.
episode. You know,
Yeah, I mean we could do that. Yeah.
I'm not saying those belong on the list, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like as you talk about things that we should talk about. I mean that again, like I was talking to my friends, and that was one that came up. Like I said, Spirited Away,
Mm-hmm.
which I know you love,
Yeah,
but also came
definitely.
up with my friends. So transitional. Um, but yeah,
So, one that I feel like I want to throw out is Speed Racer, which I know we've talked about before, and I think that there's a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily like. I think that there are a lot of people, and I'm not pointing fingers to anyone, who assumed it would be bad without ever seeing it. And then I will also certainly acknowledge that it is so aggressive in its stylistic trappings that I could imagine that being off-putting for some. But oh my God, do I love that movie. It is one, like, anytime someone says, "What's your favorite movie?" I'm not sure I would definitely say Speed Racer is my favorite movie, but it always comes to mind with that question. I love it so much. And I think that there is actually a slow moving critical consensus coming around to the idea that that movie is actually genius. I can point to many online film critics who will agree with me. So, but that's one I'm thinking about. Um,
I mean, we there's also sort of the modern comedy,
hmm?
you know, like I happen to like some of the things like Shaun of the Dead or Hot Fuzz,
Hmm? Oh
you
yeah.
know. But is there something to be said? Like honestly, like this isn't a joke. The Hangover came on the other day on TV,
Hmm.
and I watched it, and I was like, this movie was actually really funny. Like it's not a good movie, but it's funny. I mean, in an absolutely like frat boy slapstick way. But is that really that much different than the Marx Brothers? Is that something we not to say
Excuse
that's
me.
the only movie? I mean, that's just one that happened
Hmm.
to come.
We've got some good suggestions in the chat.
Yes.
The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1984's Terminator. That the line there is 1984's Terminator. All other choices are wrong. I mean, yeah, I that's a good movie.
Yeah.
Um,
All right. So I don't know if this is a controversial take, but maybe with our audience it is. I'm gonna put out there that Terminator 2 may be the best sequel that
yeah.
trumped the first movie.
Well, yeah. Like I think that. Oh gosh, now that
Empire
gives me an
Strikes
idea
Back
for episodes. Like
yeah.
the idea of pairings of like Terminator, Terminator Two, Alien, and Aliens.
Ooh, Aliens is very different too. So good. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we could also like have episodes where we like watch a franchise. Like, I feel like I wouldn't be ready to just jump on the Alien franchise right away just because I actually recently did a
Oh,
rewatch of all of that. Well,
yeah.
I was assuming we would stick to the primary, you know, sequence. Like at a certain point, like you
Yeah.
know, but then of course you got like the Star Trek movies. We've got a suggestion. My favorite movie is 1998's Living Out Loud. It's a little bit like As Good as It Gets, minus all that love can cure OCD crap. I do. I mean, I don't think I've watched that movie since I saw it in the theater, but I remember liking it.
Yeah.
Um, and then a suggestion of uh, Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan as a good sequel, also.
That's a very good sequel as well. Yep.
Yeah, like that one's really good. Although I think it's good by itself but it's not the same thing as the like. I think there's a bigger discussion to be had about the comparison of one and two for like Terminator and Terminator 2 in the ways that each progresses in the subsequent sequel, right? Also, like just
Star Trek
talking.
2, Star Trek 2 was basically a better movie made after the TV show, which is different than Terminator 2. Like Terminator 1 was the source material. Star Trek the movie was not the source material.
Yeah. And I feel like
They're
it,
different. I mean, they're different. That's all I'm saying.
yeah, no, I agree. They are that it's not as obvious a pairing of one of Star Trek motion picture and Star Trek 2. Like they don't go together in the same way. But um, but yeah, so I think the another movie that I absolutely love and would like to discuss more, since we're talking, we didn't mention him by name, but Terminator movies and Aliens, James Cameron. We talked about him because Titanic was on the list,
This
but
abyss.
The Abyss, yes, you know how much I love The Abyss.
It's like I've known you for 30 years.
Yes. So the yeah, I love The Abyss. One of the so that's another one. Another movie I'd like to see and put on the list and talk about is Groundhog Day.
Oh yeah, comedies. Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fish
Oh, and
noise.
the suggestion when we were talking about franchises, the Mission Impossible movies. I am a big fan of the Mission Impossible movies.
Uh, I am too, and that is a what a roller coaster that is.
Mm-hmm.
Of like some are phenomenal, some are
Well, two is the
good.
odd man out, right? It has its good things about it, but it also is probably the least of the films. I think it's been so long since I watched it, though. Oh man, now I want to talk about Mission Impossible movies. So I don't know. So we have to pick. We have to pick two movies for next time, and all of these are good suggestions. But each of us pick one. You pick one, I'll pick one, and we'll watch those for the next time.
If we're not limiting this is like the last time we get to watch movies and talk about it.
Oh no, no, no.
I'm
This is
going.
this is
I'm gonna.
just
I'm
for
gonna
next time.
yeah, Gladiator.
Gladiator. All right, then I'll pick Groundhog Day.
Good.
The two G's. Those are the only two G movies you ever need. Oh, I didn't mean that to be on slam on Godfather. I was just riffing. All right, so
Yeah, yeah.
next.
You want to go on a riff, like you want to talk about animated movies who are G-rated. I mean, there's a slew of them that are on this list, including recent one. Wow, what's that thing called? With the where the dad dies.
uh,
Onward.
oh, right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that movie just sort of came out of the blue as like, how great is this movie? And it didn't get its due because it didn't hit theaters because it
Yeah,
was meant to come out in March. I mean, that is a movie that probably would have been elevated on the animated scale
yeah.
had it not
Well,
come out in March of 2020.
yeah. I think there's definitely that. I think that movie is a perfect example of. I know we've discussed this in the past of a movie that has an amazing beginning and a mediocre end compared to a movie that has a mediocre beginning and an amazing end. You come out of the one with the amazing end more impressed, right? And that gets more talked about and better thought about. And I think Onward, without necessarily saying that the beginning is mediocre, I think the end is absolutely the best part. The ending is great. The rest of it is like it's actually kind of strange because the ending sort of like pulls stuff out that feels like it wasn't really set up, and yet it works anyway. Um,
But again, it also came out at a very weird
yeah.
time where
Mm-hmm,
all of our emotional triggers are in different places. You know,
mm-hmm. Yeah. So so there are this is all to illustrate that there are so many more movies to talk about that would be fun to watch and talk about. We're not going to stop the show just because we finished the AFI list. Um, so next time we will watch Groundhog Day and Gladiator. And so in the meantime, everybody, watch good movies.